Did you just shush me?
Yeah, yeah.
You
I
just
said,
shushed
shush.
me.
We have a show to do.
Oh,
You were
all
like
right.
talking about some man and his city and the arsenal that they kept things in. I don't know what it was about, or maybe it involved that
Cut
game they
me.
play where you live.
A beautiful game.
Foosball. What is it called? Football.
Football. Yeah.
Football.
Football.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am here in London and calling Rick Byer still in Chicago. Are you
Still
still
in
in Chicago?
Chicago. This is like 2 weeks in the same
That's
place.
kind of
What's
crazy, isn't
wrong? It's called winter.
it? Oh, winter.
Yes. Welcome,
Yes.
everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific, which you should check out if you haven't
Absolutely.
at
Yeah.
stephenambrosetours.com. Come on a tour with me. Come on a tour with Chris. Or
Or
if you
not.
don't like us, come on a tour with somebody
Anybody
else.
else?
And whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the HHH podcast,
Ooh.
thank you for joining us today. We are serving up a heaping helping of
Ooh.
pie and history. I know Chris is not going to be happy with my
Lots of
puns today.
bad puns today.
Let us know you're here, and if you have a cocktail, what are you drinking? And Chris, who do we have here? Looks like we have a lot of people who are already excited to be here.
Yes, we have Laurel Besenson. Doreen has joined us again.
Lorelei,
Ken. Yeah.
yeah.
And Gene Templin. Thanks for the cookies, Gene, by the way.
Oh, yes,
I might
same.
be,
Thanks to Chris and Jean for the wonderful cookies. I see Lizzie Borden here and Doreen and Laurel. So lots of familiar names and maybe some who aren't so familiar. So that's fantastic.
Absolutely.
I should mention, Chris, that we want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons.
Absolutely.
Here's a
We
list
really
of them,
appreciate it.
which I
Yes.
had to correct because I had somebody's name misspelled this week.
You dog.
I know. Maybe they will not be no. I think Susan will continue to be a top shelf patron. I don't think she's going to jump out over that.
No.
But you can help keep the history taps open by becoming a patron at patreon.com/historyhappyhour or subscribe to us on Facebook and YouTube. Okay,
All right. We're done
got
now?
all that done. Yeah.
Okay.
You ready to do a show?
I am.
All right, give me a cue.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, I'm very excited about today's show. You know, on this show, we visit historic battlefields and scenes of carnage all over the world, all through history, but we rarely stop for a snack.
That's true. More snacks are required.
And that's what we're going to do today, figuratively speaking, as we take a pie-eyed view of American history.
Oh,
Yes,
I'm
we're gonna
sorry,
make
everyone.
every
I'm really.
pun we can.
I'm sorry, everyone.
Every pun we can, whether they are flaky, half-baked, or old and crusty like you and I.
Boy, okay, cool. Let's move on.
Our,
Really
gu-
quick.
our guest today is Rossi Anastopoulo, who is the author of the book Sweet Land of Liberty. Oh, I got to pull it up here. Sweet Land of Liberty, The History of America in 11 Pies. And I want to mention that Rossi is an award-winning writer and a blog editor for King Arthur Baking Company. Welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hello, it's so great to be here.
And we
Thank
haven't
you for
driven you
joining us.
away yet, right?
Yeah, well,
I'll hang around.
No, Rossi, did you bring a cocktail today? And if so, I want to know what cocktail goes with pie.
I do have a cocktail. I have a Negroni. I don't know that it's specifically paired with pie. I unfortunately don't have any pie with me. But I think honestly, you can drink about anything with pie. It goes well with a lot of things.
Chris, what have you got today?
I have a cranberry infused gin and tonic.
Oh, wow. Check that out. Yeah. And I
And you?
have a Glenmorangie today
Oh,
in honor of my friend Vance Gilbert and his song Pie and Whiskey. So
There we go.
for me, the day is about pie and whiskey, and that's where we're going.
is Vance watching though? Since you've honored him and such.
I don't know. You know, he's a busy guy. He's a performer. I'm not sure if he's watching, but you know, we can always cut this part of the show, send it to him, and say, "Why weren't you here?" And then he'll say, "Why weren't you playing my song?" And so we can
That's
kind of go there.
Right.
But
Moving on.
Vance is a worse punster than I am, so
Oh, that's pretty
you
bad.
got to be happy that he's not here.
Um,
Oh, we do have a guest. Rossi, let me get back to you here. Let's start off with a question. I know you've heard it before. Why pie? Why did you choose pie as a medium for looking at American history in your book?
Yeah, I mean, there are several different reasons. I think one of the most important is that pie is so uniquely American. There are kind of versions of pie in various countries, a crust and a filling, but this thing we think of as American pie, typically a sweet dish, a round 9-inch circle in a crust, sometimes two, is something that's really unique to our country. And it's also been here since even before the United States existed. And so it's really been a through line for kind of every moment of the story of America. So that's one main reason. Another one is that pie is so malleable. It can take so many different forms and quite literal shapes. The filling can shift. You can have an apple pie that's made with apples or with crackers. And so the different ingredients and circumstances and people making it really shape the story behind it. And so it becomes um, a really versatile type of dish that can reflect the environment and the stories that shape it. So I find that to be really instructive. Plus, it's also kind of unnecessary. People often choose to make pie out of a sense of active choice, like they want to eat dessert as opposed to something like dinner where you just have to eat to stay alive. So there's a real sense of why people make pie is often more instructive and can be really revealing. So pie is frankly it's a humble dish, but one that is very illuminating once you kind of dig in.
Yeah. Well, so Rossi, I want to know, Rick and I both spend an awful lot of time with history, and we read a lot of really heavy tomes and some pretty serious and stuff. But I don't think food history really kind of gets the attention that it deserves a lot of time. And I find it utterly fascinating. I find your book utterly fascinating. What do you think it is about? What can the study of food and foodways, and in your case pies, tell us about history, and how does it help our understanding of the past?
Yeah, I mean, food is always there. It's something that is always a part of not just, big moments in history, but the small everyday moments. And so I think for that reason, it's so woven into the fabric of daily life. And so is really reflective of that. And so it really becomes something that is always there. And so it's always tied to what's going on in history. And I think also food is really unique because so many hands and stories and people influence it. I think that's what's so fascinating about many dishes, including pie, is that there's often no one origin story of like so and so had an idea, came up with this pie, and then that's the end of the story. There's so many influences behind the ingredients and where they come from, or the techniques, or the way a dish like pie will evolve with the different influences. And because so many people and populations and communities play a role in shaping this dish that we have today. And I think that's the other thing that's so unique about food is that, you can eat it. You can take a pie recipe that someone made in 1850 and you can make it again in your home and have it be, pretty similar to what someone back then ate it. So I think it becomes a really tangible link to history, thing that you can understand. I think it's easy to kind of think of history as like a storybook. And when you eat pie or any other food that has that connection, you kind of sit yourself in that same seat that someone hundreds of years ago or decades ago might have been in as well. And so it kind of makes it more real and more tangible, which is what I find so exciting about it.
Yeah.
I want to ask about apple pie, which is what you start and finish your book with. But before I do that, or I don't want to go too far off the track, but I was kind of surprised. Perhaps I am simply being kind of guilty of not having a wide enough worldview, that pie, as it is manifested today, is considered American. That there are people. I would have thought, well, pie must have come from Germany and England and stuff, and people have been eating some sort of pie for a long time. But the idea that pie is an American dessert. I mean, if you're in London, Chris, can you get a piece of pie at a restaurant?
Well, that's one of the things that actually kind of feeds into a question I have.
Well, you can go ahead with it.
Oh, no,
We'll throw all the questions to you at once, and then you can do all the answers at once in the second half of the show.
No, but you don't. So one of the things that's interesting, Rossi, you can get into this, but the origin story of apple pie. You talk about the English, connection to it, but you don't go to restaurants in England now and say, "I want a piece of pie for dessert," right? pies are something you put meat into. So yeah, it's interesting that that it starts as you explain, kind of in England, but now we don't have that same connection here. So getting back to you, Rick, is it an American
Yeah, so
dessert?
what's the deal with apple pie? And, we've all heard American is apple pie. Somebody's already put that comment up in the comment pane. So get us started on that story.
Yeah, I mean, before I do, I just want to say, Chris, I was just in London actually a few weeks
No.
ago, and I was
Okay.
there with my dad, and I think we walked by a pub, and they had a sign that said like, British pies, and he was
Yeah.
like, "We have to go try pie, you have to know." I was like, "No, Dad, you don't understand. Like, it's a different thing." And he's vegetarian.
Yeah.
I was like, "You will not like this British pie." Um,
No. No.
but it is very different. And I think that comes back. I talked to one food historian once about kind of the difference between like savory pies as we think of with those British and European influences, and the sweet pies that we think of as American. And she kind of chalked it up to like Americans have a bigger sweet tooth. She's like, we just love sweet things. So I don't know
Oh,
if it's
but
quite.
nobody has a bigger sweet tooth than the Brits. I can't agree with that.
I do think that is a distinguishing factor. There are sweet pies elsewhere, but in America, you hear pie and you immediately think sweet and dessert. And I think that is kind of a defining hallmark. But, it kind of comes back in part to apple pie. So that's a pie that has a strong link to British foodways, and, is something that came directly from a lot of the British colonists. Even though apples didn't exist in North America, we had crab apples, but they weren't something that's native to this continent. So it was really something that apples were brought over, and you can kind of draw a through line to like colonization and implanting this fruit and this crop that comes from elsewhere and kind of takes root here literally and flourishes and becomes the foundation of apple pie. So apple pie was made commonly, in the first, couple hundred years of America, but it really wasn't until the end of the 1800s, getting into the 1900s, that it became to take on this like symbolic importance and become as American as apple pie, become this real symbol of what it meant to be American and this patriotic thing. And, there are a lot of influences in that. War was a big one. World War II and World War I were, there are a lot of stories about soldiers abroad who missed apple pie. They wanted their mom's apple pie. They're fighting for mom and apple pie. There's an anecdote about a general, I think this was World War I, who wanted to like get the morale of his soldiers up. So he's like, we're going to get the Salvation Army ladies to like make them some apple pie. So like really like boost them with that. And so it became, this broader symbol of home and nostalgia, and, became a part of advertising. It was used in suit advertisements. Suits were as American as apple pie. It kind of got a little presidential sheen when, it was included in a presidential cookbook, and FDR said it was his favorite type of pie. And it just started to take on this broader symbolism in that century that kind of has created this dish that is so much bigger than just, a 9-inch pastry and a pie plate. And really, I'm so glad someone already called out as American as apple pie, because I think it's something that we all think of, and we all might be like the foremost pie in American culture.
Can I jump back in, Chris?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, well, first thing, I did think it was fascinating that Mrs. Nesbitt, who was Roosevelt's chef, wrote a cookbook, since she was widely regarded as just a terrible chef, and that the food at the White House during the Roosevelt years was considered awful by almost everyone who visited. So that was interesting. But you talked about how American apple pie kind of becomes American, but it really is a kind of a big deal in Britain, back when pies are called coffins because they're made out of pastry that's like a coffin. You talk about that. And there's a poem in your book, I think it's on page 20. Can you read us that to give you a sense of how, in 1713, how Britons thought pie was kind of their own?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I have the book here. So it's a poem quite literally titled Apple Pie, pie spelled Pye, which is fun. And as you mentioned, it dates to 1713 and goes, of all the delicates which Britons try to please the palate and delight the eye, of all the several kinds of sumptuous fare, there's none that can with apple pie compare, for costly flavor or substantial pace, for outward beauty or for inward taste.
So then why, and maybe there's no good answer to this, but what goes wrong in England? What goes wrong? That is it the revolution? Did we rebel and start changing, taking the U's out of words after we rebelled, and they said, well, in return we're going to reject pie? I mean, what happens?
Well, we were busy trying to figure out how to fry fish and what other things on our plate. We had a lot going on.
It is an interesting question because there is a shift, like getting into kind of the late 1800s, the 1900s, where Britons start thinking about apple pie as American, which is so funny because, if you really trace the origins, it goes back to their country. But there's, something like the Brits started kind of bashing American apple pie, which is quite funny. So I'm not entirely sure what happened in those intervening years, in England. But
you can read the bashing quote if you want, Chris, and then I will cede this conversation. I think that's on page 254.
I think it is. That's awfully specific, Rick.
Yeah, I've been planning this for weeks, Chris.
So yes, in 1927, the London Evening News wrote, "American pie breeds dyspepsia, dyspepsia breeds restlessness, and restlessness begets a feverish but nonetheless formidable material progress. The American apple pie is the sheer gastronomic equivalent of an incendiary bomb." So really like some harsh words for
it might be complimentary.
Well, maybe that's why the British gave America pie and said, we're done with it. No.
Yeah, we're going to put it on you.
They liked us so much, they wanted us to have the pie, and they're sacrificing
something about giving you the dyspepsia, I think.
Yeah, well, I'll give you some dyspepsia.
You do. Oh, yeah. So, back to like the serious stuff. You say that, Ross, pie is a barometer of American society. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think because a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, because it kind of shapeshifts to, the circumstances that it's in. I think that the literal pies and how they adapt to where they are in American society can be quite instructive. So, you have kind of desperation pies during the Great Depression, and those are very simple, humble, made with very basic, bare ingredients that kind of reflects where most families were at that time. But I think it also comes down to how people talk about pie. So it's not even literally the recipe at times, it's sometimes people's attitude towards pie. So we talked about apple pie and kind of how the language around it took on this symbolic patriotic importance. But, there are times like, especially in the mid 20th century, where pie became a symbol for domestic success and kind of the stereotypical ideal of what American housewife should be. And so this attitude towards pie was something that should be prepared, for the family by a woman working from home, and also be something that, is perfect and beautiful and delicious and fail-proof and easy to make. And, that was used in a lot of advertisements for food brands and corporations. So I think it's not just, pie isn't just a barometer because of what it physically or, literally looks like, but also people's attitudes towards it and how they discuss it.
So, your book is fun, but it's not all fun. I think that's important to say. It's got a very serious side to it as well. And you talk about some different kind of tough subjects in some places. Apples are not indigenous to North America, but pumpkins are, and pumpkin actually, as you write, is a Wampanoag word. I grew up in Rhode Island, where the Wampanoag, we were about a quarter of a mile from the Wampanoag Trail, and it's a dish that many of us associate with Thanksgiving. But you suggest that if we take a hard look at pumpkin pie, it's really not telling a happy story.
No, it's not. And I think that, pumpkin pie specifically, and then just pie in general and Thanksgiving are so intertwined that, in some ways can't talk about pie without touching on this like very, notable holiday. And yeah, if you, thankfully we're having more honest conversations, I think, in this country about the reality of Thanksgiving and how, there probably wasn't quite what we like to think about as a Thanksgiving, and having more open and honest dialogue around that. And it comes down to pie too. There's a reason that pumpkin pie is so symbolic of this kind of myth. And what it comes back to, and this idea that pumpkins were a staple food of indigenous populations in America. When European colonizers come over, they kind of take this indigenous product, this pumpkin, and morph it into a kind of European dish in the form of pie. And, what does that tell us about just the broader experience of, Native populations and European populations, and how that eventually played out, and how pie, and pumpkin pie specifically, becomes kind of a tool in this myth making around Thanksgiving. And it becomes this symbol for a more harmonious relationship than truly existed. And especially around the mid 19th century, it shows up in poems about Thanksgiving, and fictional anecdotes about Thanksgiving, and helped kind of create this holiday and this American culture built around this legacy of something that has in many ways been sanitized over time. And so pumpkin pie is, I think, really emblematic of that broader story, and a good lens through which to sort of examine these broader, cultural factors.
So Rossi, I want to kind of pick up on that, because one of the things that struck me as you were talking about the various pies is a lot of them have their origin story in some in pain, right, or suffering. And I don't want to take it too far, but what is the connection? But how are they coming out of this sort of terrible situation? And you don't have to use pumpkin pie as an example, but there are others in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in some ways, pie is a really great example, because, I've mentioned, like, it is a European and British dish that came to North America and flourished and became a symbol, of the United States. And, there are so many threads of kind of the legacy of colonization and that. But I think generally, like, food often comes from, food history can often kind of touch on these themes in a way beyond pie. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. And so, that is the birthplace of the Confederacy. And that's a place where our food culture, and I think broader Southern food, was shaped by the work and knowledge and skill of enslaved populations. And, that both in the ingredients and the skills and techniques. And it's something that isn't always acknowledged. Sweet potato pie is a good example of that story, but it emerges from that history. And I think that pie and food in general, we need to be more honest and acknowledge the influences, of Black chefs and caterers in Charleston, like I said, to use that example, and just more generally, as well as so many other, people who have shaped pie and who have shaped food. And so I think that it's not necessarily just pie, but pie is a really great example of this broader trend in American food culture and that history.
Well, one of the things that really struck me that runs through a lot of your stories is the central role of food in general, pie in particular, in creating or trying to create or recreate a sense of culture or comfort. People, one example you talk about is sweet potato pie, that the slave population that comes over, enslaved people that are brought over from Africa, in Africa it's yams. They're trying to find something that can kind of recreate some of the experience they had there. And then, the idea of people making, as you say, pie is unnecessary, but it might be necessary in terms of providing comfort or providing a kind of a cultural touch point.
Yeah, and I think that it's a great example because if you look at kind of the three stages of sweet potato pie, you look at the sweet potato dessert that enslaved populations are making, and often it was very incredibly simple as reflective of living conditions. So it'd be like ash roasted sweet potatoes, or very very rustic sweet potato cobblers, or not even at times quite pie, because like I said, the conditions, but the sweet potato pies that enslaved populations did have access to eat were often part of harvest celebrations or very rare periods throughout the year, to kind of show, I think, that kind of shows that scarcity and that in access to sweet potato pie. But that wasn't the only sweet potato pie they were making. They were often making them in plantation kitchens, and Black chefs perfected and really influenced the legacy of sweet potato pies, but they were making them in kitchens and barred from eating them. And it wasn't until after emancipation when, many of these Black Southerners could live in freedom and establish even communities like Freetown, where, suddenly the sweet potato pie was something that they could make themselves and eat and celebrate around and enjoy with their family. And I think it kind of the evolution of sweet potato pie from something that kind of starts in, is kind of steeped in pain and starts in that legacy, then evolves over time and is ultimately reclaimed by many Black Southerners and other Black Americans to become a really important touchstone in Black food culture. And so it becomes a redemptive story that I think ultimately reflects kind of the broader story of the Black experience, especially in the South. And yeah, so pie can be difficult and hard, but can also ultimately have, have more warmth and I guess positive nostalgia around it, as it kind of evolves throughout American history too.
So Rossi, we're getting lots of kind of worried comments here in the comments box. So I'm going to ask you the question. This should be an easy one to answer, but answer it quickly and then maybe expand on it. But here we go. So, Frank, just out of curiosity, are there any pie recipes in the book? So maybe you can reassure the viewers that
I think we got that one covered.
There are, Frank, there are pie recipes in the book. Each chapter has a corresponding pie recipe. So it's not a cookbook. There aren't, not full of pictures and recipes, but each chapter so that you can read about this pie, learn all about it, and then experience it for yourself.
There's one right
Yeah.
there.
Yes,
and I want to just say about your pie recipes that they're great because they don't have 42 paragraphs of blather before you get to the recipe. You just there's the recipe, got it.
No, they just have a whole chapter's worth of blather.
Yeah, that's okay though, because I'm not looking at that the same way. I mean, the worst thing is when you're trying to find a recipe online and you just really want to know what temperature to roast your Brussels sprouts at, and the person gives you the life story of their interaction with Brussels sprouts. And I don't know how we got onto that, Chris.
Thanks for letting us know you eat Brussels sprouts.
Really I love Brussels sprouts.
So Rossi, it's again getting back to okay, good. When we're studying history and American history in particular, we've heard of things like as far as books and seminal tracts, we've heard about Common Sense, maybe from Tom Paine, or Poor Richard's Almanac from Ben Franklin, but one book that I don't think many Americans know about, and I think probably should, is I'm going to read the full title here. American Cookery, or the Art of Dressing Viands, Fish, Poultry, and Vegetables, and the Best Modes of Making Pastes, Puffs, Pies, Tarts, Puddings, Custards, and Preserves, and all kinds of cakes from the imperial plum to the plain cake. Adopted to this country and all grades of life, by Amelia Simmons. Now, why don't we all have to read that in school, and why is it important?
I think it's incredibly important. So for those not familiar, this is the first, American cookbook, what it's widely considered by Amelia Simmons. And it was written for, people living in America based on ingredients they would find here too. So it's really, as it says in the subtitle, really meant for people living here in this burgeoning nation of the United States. And so it is an incredibly influential text. If you think about what people were eating as a fledgling country and in this part of the world, it really captures it. It captures a national identity that was incredibly important. And there, I think it's not until the second edition, if I can recall, but there are explicitly patriotic dishes like election cake and things like that. And so it really is meant to be a truly American cookbook. And yeah, if you think about, all the different pieces of, symbolism and text and just important cultural building artifacts in kind of the creation of American identity, first cookbook's pretty important. And it also includes, the first quote unquote American apple pie recipe. And yeah, I wish that, more people did discuss it. I think that, domestic arts and cooking and baking and, traditionally female work like that is often dismissed, maybe isn't always given the credit that it's due as, something incredibly important to society and building culture. And so, more respect for cookbooks and their place in
Absolutely.
that. It's, really important and really awesome.
There's some other, you found a lot of great cookbooks that you deep dig into and talk about, including a Confederate cookbook. And one of the first, or perhaps the first cookbook written by an African-American chef. Can you talk a little bit about those two? Or any others that you want to?
Yeah, so the Confederate recipe book is known for, or highlighted in the book specifically for including a recipe for mock apple pie. So this is a pie meant to be It's an apple pie, but it's made with crackers instead of apples, and so really reflects the scarcity of the times. There are some other recipes in this cookbook that do similar things, like I think there's acorn coffee, and recipes really meant for times of hardship and distress, that speaks to how people were making do, and instances like that. So right, like they still wanted to make pie, and so we're kind of coming up with these creative instances to be able to do that. And then, so that speaks to mock apple pie. And then there's also, one of the first cookbooks by Black author, a domestic cookbook by Miss Melinda Russell, includes a sweet potato pie recipe. And so this is reflective of that story I talked about earlier of, sweet potato pie being reclaimed by the Black chefs and cooks who originally baked it in plantation kitchens and now are baking it not only themselves for their families or their own communities, but also are getting credit for their work. So there were a lot of white authored cookbooks published prior to that were based on the knowledge and skill of enslaved chefs in many ways, but those chefs weren't given credit. And so now we know this is Miss Melinda Russell. This is her recipe, and she has full ownership of her recipes, like the sweet potato pie. So a really important cookbook in telling the story of Black American food and sweet potato pie, especially.
Before you ask your next question,
we have a bunch of questions.
I just want to remind people that we are talking to Rossi Anastopoulo, who is the author of Sweet Land of Liberty, A History of America in 11 Pies, because people want to know, and that usually means it's because they want to buy the book. So we're putting that up there, and then Chris, over to you for whatever you want to go.
Well, yeah, I'm going to kind of continue with that idea of cookbooks. How important are cookbooks in creating a sense of American identity and regional identity? Because I have to be honest with you, before I read the book, I just didn't really give it enough thought. And
I never thought about it.
And I was like, holy cow, these are critical to giving people an idea of who they are.
Yeah, because I think it often speaks to your point, to place. Cookbooks are written to especially historically when we didn't have kind of the global access to food that we do today. They're written to the ingredients and the foods that people had access to in the place where they were living. So they really are, speaking to life in a particular time and place. And in many ways they can be. There's so many layers. Like I mentioned, those Southern white author cookbooks that, were speaking to women who were expected to either own slaves or, have access to that kind of domestic labor that would make their lives much easier and their housework much easier. And so I think that it kind of shapes certain class attitudes or certain just like ways of life for certain populations and can kind of speak to that. And they also, as I spoke to before about the importance of just like food history and food and thinking about identity, like they reflect what people are baking and cooking and eating in their day-to-day lives, or what they want to bake and cook and eat in their everyday lives, which maybe isn't always the same thing. And so I think that cookbooks speak to domestic life in a way that few other types of literature really do. And sometimes they are what's the right word? They're meant to achieve certain goals that maybe aren't quite on the surface of teaching people. So, cookbooks have been used to provide a path of assimilation for immigrant populations in the United States. So, sometimes they're meant to indoctrinate a certain way of life, and they're not necessarily reflective of that, but they're meant to be, a beacon for people to try to, quote unquote, become more American, whatever that means.
Well, it's interesting because my mother had a collection when I was growing up of about 3,000 cookbooks in our house. And she had grown up in the Depression, and although she lived part of her teen years on a farm, she recalled going to the doctor as a young adult woman, and the doctor having noted in her record that she had signs of malnutrition. And really, it wasn't until I was reading your book and I was thinking about the role of food and culture and the role of cookbooks. She didn't necessarily make a ton of dishes from all these different cookbooks, but she loved to read them. And somehow that it was giving her comfort from a time when food hadn't been too plentiful, or somehow it was a very comfortable place for her to go, essentially. And I had never really thought of food in that way.
Yeah, I mean, food
Yeah,
is
I don't know where you go with that. So
it's tremendously nostalgic or, aspirational like that, or comforting. And I think that's the real power. And I think pie especially um, can convey a lot of that, even more so than some other dishes. It often has that really strong emotional and nostalgic connection that makes it really powerful. But yeah, cookbooks are very important, and I think we should discuss them more.
So Rossi, I again, to kind of bring the questions back to pie, we had another very concerned viewer that wanted to know about the origin of blueberry pie, and since that doesn't really get talked about in the book, this will be a little bonus. So they'll buy the book, they'll go, but what about blueberry pie? And this is your chance to help out our viewer.
Well, there are some pies. So unfortunately, not every pie has.
I know, no Boston cream pie.
Yeah, Chris lambasted the author before the show over the lack of Boston cream pie in the book. I'm amazed you were able to cover up all the tears and emotional bruising from that to be able to come on and be so positive.
Yes, well, maybe in the sequel, maybe I'll have.
All right, good.
But yeah, so I think that as I mentioned, pie sometimes just kind of evolves, and so I think that blueberry pie, I don't know of any particular revolutionary origin story to it. My inclination is to say that's probably something where, as this tradition of sweet pies in America develops, sweet pies made with fruit like apple pies, pies just made with kind of whatever is available, whatever fruits or other produces or ingredients are available. That speaks to the malleability and adaptability of pie. So blueberry pie is probably something where people had access to blueberries, and they also had pie baked into their food traditions and kind of merged the two. So I don't know if you're going to get a really earth-shattering answer to that, but I think it kind of speaks to the way people have folded pie into their everyday life and use produce like blueberries to make really delicious versions. But I also love blueberry pie, so whoever asked that, I'm with you on that one.
Well, and we have just, these aren't questions so much as a couple of comments probably worth sharing. One from Nancy Nallens, who says, to your point, my mom was from an Italian family. When she married my dad from Polish immigrants, she had to learn to cook Polish food. And my wife's mother was from a Bohemian, Czech family. She had to learn to cook Italian food, and kind of, that's a whole, again, this idea of food and culture kind of going together is really quite fascinating. And Liz Mumford says, as a collector of regional cookbooks gleaned from travels, travel memories and experiences really resonate through the food that was experienced, either through direct experience of eating the food, or in fact, like we're talking about, reading about it in cookbooks, kind of studying it. So it all speaks to kind of the centrality of food and culture.
Yes, and I love that Liz brought that up, because I was actually just paging through. I don't have it within reach, but the cookbook My Sweet Mexico by Fanny Garrison, which is all about the sweet desserts and pastries of Mexico and Mexico City. And to that point, I felt like I was in Mexico City. I felt like I was traveling just through the stories and the recipes and the photos. So I think that you're right. It can take you to another place in time, but also another place in the world that is really reflective of a very specific travel experience. So yeah, they're really great for kind of armchair travel too.
And can you please kind of delve into the cake pie divide? I mean, because actually there's a serious part to the argument. But what is the argument, and what does it say?
Yeah, so cake, for anyone who's a baker out there, will know that cake is not quite as forgiving as pie. Pie sometimes gets a bad rap for the crust being a little bit difficult or finicky, but at its heart, pie is pretty rustic and malleable. If you can get a good pastry crust, which is made with very basic ingredients, flour and butter and maybe a hint of sugar or salt, then you kind of throw anything into the filling and it's probably going to turn out well, and you can be quite imprecise with it in a way that isn't always true of baking, whereas cake, you really can't. Cake, you've got to be very precise with it. It takes a lot of, it might take more higher-end ingredients like finer chocolates or, nuts or anything like that, and, different equipment and things like that. So historically, cake was much more, considered much more elegant and probably more difficult to make or kind of whip together in a way that pie was. So if you're thinking about like there's an anecdote about a group of settlers traveling west, and one of their party makes a mock apple pie. She whips up an apple pie out of crackers to kind of replicate the apple pie of home. Think about that. You're probably not going to be able to whip up a cake, in the middle of your travels west, and probably very limited ingredients or equipment or things like that. And so I think that kind of illustrates that kind of divide between these two types of baking. And also, sometimes it comes down to preference. My dad does not like cake. He loves pie. And so pie has become our central birthday dessert as a result of that. So I think sometimes it's also just this gut feeling, people like one and not the other.
You can like both.
Or you can like both, of course.
I like both.
Yeah.
You've mentioned this a couple of times, but I need to go back to this. When I was growing up, if you were eating some Ritz crackers and you looked on the box, and I haven't done that lately, so I don't know what's on the box now, but when I was a kid, there was always a recipe for mock apple pie made out of Ritz crackers, which I thought sounded like the most ridiculous imaginable thing in the world. And literally, that's all I ever knew about mock apple pie, was that it was the recipe on the Ritz cracker box. Come along to read Sweet Land of Liberty, and I thought one of the most interesting chapters was the chapter on mock apple pie, with the first part being that it dates back to before the Civil War. So why is this? Tell us a little bit about this story and what mock apple pie, kind of how it has resonated down through history, and what that says about the central role of pie.
Yeah, so this cracker pie, mock apple pie, some of the first references are to the 1850s on that journey out west. Shows up in the Civil War. It was in the Confederate.
And briefly, in 25 words or less, how do you make crackers taste like apples?
Yes, I also highly recommend. It really does taste like apples. I highly recommend people try it. It's a great party trick. Basically, crush up crackers, and you fold them into a sugar syrup with spices and usually an acid to replicate the tang of apples, like a cream of tartar or lemon juice, and then bake them. So it comes like kind of a mushy, spiced, kind of chunky applesauce type of mixture. But because you have the spices and that tang and that sweetness, really does taste like apples. Wow. And then you bake that in a crust.
Wow. That's like the pie version of Tastes Like Chicken, isn't it?
Yeah. But it's before the Civil War. It's going through the Depression, and it seems to be all about people, and even into COVID, as you talk about. It's all about people sort of trying to grab some piece of comfort someplace.
Yes, it's really about making do with what you have, and really about, I think, speaks to the power of pie and apple pie more specifically, to comfort in times of hardship or distress or scarcity, to provide a sense of normalcy in times of upheaval. I think, to your point, if you look even as recently as COVID a couple years ago, during kind of the worst of the lockdown, when people didn't want to go to the store, didn't want to venture into public, people kind of turned to a lot of Depression era recipes, and mock apple pie was one of them, and they started baking it. And it's, again, trying to recapture a sense of normalcy in a time when, things feel anything but.
So I'm going to read, I thought about this question. There's a quote in here I wanted to read. So we'll start with this. You have an author, Marjorie Rawlings, who says of pecan pie, which you go into some
which
depth
is the best.
Baloney.
Pecan pie is the best.
Again, Rick, you are wrong. It so often happens. It's apple with cheddar, and you know it.
We're going to come back to apple with cheddar, which is good, but pecan pie is the best.
Well, after this quote, you might not think
Please
so.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Marjorie
You're
Rawlings
welcome.
said of pecan pie, which Rick says is the best, which relies heavily on processed corn syrup for a sweetener. Fat men in particular are addicted to it. I have nibbled at the utterly deadly Southern pecan pie and have served it to those in whose welfare I took but little interest. In the chapter on pecan pie, again, one of the other fascinating, eye-opening chapters, you talk a little bit or a lot about the role that pie plays in kind of mass consumerism and the spread of processed foods, and touch a little bit on that and explain to Rick why pecan pie is not the best pie.
I mean, I do love pecan pie. I love
Oh,
all
no,
kinds.
love it. I love
And,
it.
and bonus points if you can get Napoleon in there. So
Yes. So the chapter opens up with an anecdote about Napoleon. Yes, that Napoleon kind of incentivizing the basically the introduction of canning and food preservation that kind of sowed the seeds for the eventual kind of commercialization of food and the mass production that Chris just mentioned. And, one of the most emblematic of those ingredients, I think, is corn syrup. So Caro corn syrup is a brand that hits the scene in the turn of the century and becomes incredibly popular throughout the US. In part because of a massive publicity campaign. They were publishing cookbooks, like the Caro cookbook that had wildly wrong information about the health qualities of corn syrup, and kind of was emblematic of this trend towards not only processed foods, but also branded foods and name brand foods and the nationalization of many of those brands. And so corn syrup and Caro corn syrup develops a recipe for pecan pie in the 30s. And that becomes, it becomes so linked to Caro that it becomes not just pecan pie, but it becomes like Caro pecan pie. And really the two become indistinguishable. They're linked in a way that helped popularize pecan pie throughout the country. Pecan pie existed long before Caro, but it was something that was often a bit more of a niche regional staple, and then kind of spreads to every corner of the country, kind of off the back of the literal Caro bottles that include the recipe. So, and then if you kind of take things further, corn syrup is the foundation of almost everything that we eat now in, processed food in America. And pecan pie kind of goes along for that ride and becomes something that, many of us maybe have strong feelings about, positive or negative, but we at least all know in our family.
And I don't eat very much because of all those reasons, but it is a favorite. So I wanted to go back to apple pie with cheese. And Doreen Goslin helps me to do that with her comment. And she writes, I read the other day that Vermont actually has a law that states that you must eat a specific amount of cheddar cheese with apple pie, a minimum measured amount. Now, such a thing sounds, of course, totally ridiculous, but we are well prepared for this question, aren't we, Rossi? Tell us about that.
Yes, so there is a law. I work with a lot of people who live in Vermont because I work for King Arthur Baking Company, and I actually asked them about this law, and they were not familiar with it. So I don't know if it's a very well-known law, even in Vermont, but there is an official law that I think you have a photo of to maybe share that shows. So a good faith effort. Maybe Good Faith is doing a lot of work there. Really made to meet one of the conditions being a slice of cheddar cheese weighing a minimum of a half ounce with apple pie. So there you go, Doreen. Very, very on top of it because that is absolutely true.
And a glass of cold milk.
Yes.
And or is it and or? Oh, it's just one of the following. So you don't have to have cheese, milk, and ice cream.
Yeah, if that was the dairy overload, that would be.
And none of this is related to the fact that dairy farming is a big industry in Vermont. Is it by any chance?
No, it's because it tastes good.
Okay. But apple pie with cheese is quite good. But that is kind of a dividing line, isn't it? There are people who are quite taken aback by that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a text from my cousin when she was reading the book who was very scandalized. She was like, I cannot believe this is a thing. Cheese and pie. She couldn't really get on board. But she lives in Florida, so that might tell you something.
Well, they don't even have pie there.
There's a quote in your book that says, an apple pie without cheese is like a kiss without a squeeze.
See?
And that's as racy as we get here in History Happy Hour.
So again, we kind of weave between really funny things in the book, but also kind of serious things. So, using maybe the example of bean pie, can you talk about how pie really becomes a political, the tool, weapon, but it takes on a much bigger significance?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So bean pie is a pie that's foundational to the Nation of Islam. And so it comes about when Elijah Muhammad, the then leader of the Nation of Islam, writes a book about, the dietary tenets of the nation and kind of what members should be eating. And this whole dietary thesis is based on the idea of separating from white society and white food traditions and the slave diet, as he termed it. And so this idea that, in order to have a flourishing Black culture and Black food system and food, culture, you've got to forget about white influence like that. And so part of that is something like, rejecting ingredients like sweet potatoes that are, as we mentioned, very foundational to the diets of enslaved persons, and embracing new ingredients, one of which was kind of inexplicably the navy bean. It's kind of unclear why he loved the navy bean, but this was a very important ingredient that he championed. And as a result, many members of the Nation of Islam started to develop recipes, including, quite funnily enough, a cake frosting with navy beans. But without a doubt, the most notable dish is the navy bean pie, the bean pie. And it's something that, was sold by Nation members, was served at Nation of Islam owned restaurants and bakeries. It was baked by Muhammad Ali's chef. For him, it was his favorite dish. And there's a New York Times article when he first started to kind of hit the scene, and he's said to be eating not one but two bean pies. So he really loved it. And so it becomes emblematic of this, it becomes a symbol of Black power and, Black independence that, was part of the Nation of Islam's whole messaging, and really shows how food as a piece of culture and cultural creation can really play a role in kind of leaving behind the past and kind of charting a new future.
Rossi, I want to. You've covered a lot of stories in your book. There are a lot of pies. I think 11 that are mentioned by that get chapters, and a few others that maybe just get mentioned. And we've talked about a few stories in here. So I would ask you kind of a two-part question as we come near the end, which is what is there a favorite story of yours that we kind of haven't touched on, or something that you would want people to kind of know about that we haven't gotten into, and what's the takeaway? You worked on this project for I don't know how long. How long did you work on the project?
Oh, about 2.5 years.
And how many pies did you make during that time?
A lot of pies. I don't know if I have a lot.
So we have 2 years and dozens or more pies. So a favorite story that we haven't heard, and kind of your takeaway on the project as you've emerged from the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite chapters to write, and kind of the one full of the funniest stories, is the tofu pie chapter that comes towards the end. It's the second to last one.
Excuse me, tofu pie. I must have skipped over that chapter.
Pie as a weapon.
What?
Pie is a literal political weapon.
Oh, right.
This chapter is all about how activists, kind of in the latter half of the 20th century and even into the 21st century, quite literally start hurling pies in people's faces as a form of protest. And so there's a lot of really fun stories. Everyone from Bill Gates to Sylvester Stallone was hit with a pie. So it was probably much more widespread than I think I even realized before I started researching that chapter. And a lot of fabulous pie puns in there, and some really interesting characters. So that is one that was really a delight to write, and I found a lot of joy. Especially, it's so different. It's a pie that's not even meant to be eaten, which certainly puts it on a different level.
That's why it's okay to put tofu in it.
But I had a question about it. So I'm assuming you made all the pies in your book. And did you make a pie as a weapon? And if so, do you eat it, or is it inedible?
Or did you throw it at somebody?
I was just curious. Like, if you go to all that trouble, like if you're in a pinch at the protest, do you eat it, or what happens?
Yeah, so tofu, the tofu cream pie recipe that comes from the Biotic Baking Brigade, which is an activist group that threw pies. That the pie, I mean, I made it. The recipe's in the book. I made it a couple times to test it, and it's actually pretty good. It's not. It's pretty good. The key is to use shelf stable and not refrigerated tofu, because the shelf stable one has kind of a less tofu flavor.
Okay.
But yeah, it's better than you think it'll be. So that might be a low bar to clear, but it's actually pretty good.
I'm just curious. Yeah. Well, and I was happy to know though that Tesco actually carried out tests. Tesco being a British supermarket chain, to see what was the most effective pie as a weapon. But they wanted to. What was it? Polite chaos. They want to have like.
Yes, they wanted like a nice, polite mess, and not chaotic, like all over the place.
We're very polite here, Rick.
Yeah.
I've been been looking around because I thought of another, when you write the sequel to this book, another story that you can put in is the story of Frisbees, which are born out of actually pie tins from the Frisbee Pie Company. So that can go, either you can make that go into the blog or it can go into the next, Pi 2 or whatever, Pi Squared or whatever, whatever you would call that follow-up book. Chris, do you have one more question? Or
Well, I wanted to, I want to help out our viewers because we have lots of people that are really obviously passionate about pie.
Yeah, this
much
show
more
has gotten
so than they are about anything else we've talked about. So clearly you've touched a nerve here. But one of our viewers wants to know, Liz Mumford wants to know, she has a book club and they're going to be reading The Killer Angels, which is a book about Gettysburg. And she wants to know what kind of pie she should bake to take to her book club.
Oh my goodness.
That's Civil War era.
Yeah, I mean, you could try the mock apple pie, as something that was included in my Confederate recipe book. I think that's the only one off the top of my head that I can directly link to the Civil War in any way. Or
and
maybe,
as you say, it would be a great party trick. You bring it up, thanks for the nice apple pie. Well, funny thing. It's
exactly. Real conversation starter. So maybe that's the one.
Dastardly rebels.
Liz, we are helping you out in every way that we can. So, Rossi, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, A Sweet Land of Liberty, A History of America in 11 Pies. We did get a lot of great conversation. It was a really enjoyable book to read. And I want to just say a very well-researched book. I really felt the research coming through in every page, and yet it's also very entertaining at the same time. So congratulations on that. Thank you for joining us. As I cannot help myself from saying,
no.
even though I'm sure you've heard it before, bye-bye, Miss American Pie.
Oh, God. Now she's never going to come back.
Well, thank you. It's been a real joy to be here and to talk pie with you guys.
We really appreciate it, guys. It was a fascinating book. And
it was great. Stay well. Okay, Chris, sorry. I am unable to resist. I'm weak.
I know.
What can I tell you? I'm weak. So next week, Chris, we are going to.
Oh wait, no, next week is good. Okay.
Moving right along. Next week, we're going to do an encore show about Revolutionary War privateers. Pioneers. Well, they're pioneering privateers with Eric J. Dolan. This was a great show. It was a lot of fun, really interesting. And then, as we mentioned, the week after that, we're doing Iron and Blood. Is it Iron and Blood or Blood and Iron? It's
Blood and Iron.
It's big.
Yeah.
It's Iron and Blood. Sorry, you lose.
Oh,
you must have read it backwards. So we need 2 weeks to read them. So I'm going to start tonight.
Well, I want to say that Rossi's book was fascinating and refreshing and yummy and
tasty.
I want to have some more food history related books on the show because it was a really great.
It was eye-opening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so so if you guys have suggestions, let us know, and we can take a look at them because it doesn't have to be war and disaster every week. Please, no. Anyway, so next week, Privateers, 2 weeks, Iron and Blood, and guys, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody. Just a reminder that you can check us out, subscribe on YouTube and Facebook, and of course at historyhappyhour.com. Thanks,
everybody. Be safe.